Scrum and Kanban, and I may not even be pronouncing Kanban correctly, but correctly. And it's going to be a conversation about people's experiences with either framework, and also kind of, I think it's important that we have a chance to network. I know a lot of times you come to these meetings and you don't have time to really network, and it's completely informal, guys. So if you want to get up, grab a beer, just, we're all adults, and we're here to share and educate each other on these topics. So I'll start off first by introducing Ken. And Ken, prior to beginning with our speakers. So Ken is the product marketing manager here at Atlassian. And you can go to Atlassian.com and learn everything about it. I think he'll tell you a little bit right now. And Atlassian is a provider of software development and collaboration tools that help teams deliver products faster from concept to launch.
Said very well. So thanks for the introduction, Serge. Basically I'm the product marketing manager for Jira. If you guys aren't familiar with Jira, it's a product tracking tool, somewhat popular. We also have Greenhopper, which is our Agile planning tool, which is on top of that. I'm partly responsible for that. So I was actually really eager to see this meetup happen because we've added a bunch of functionality in Greenhopper in the last year around Kanban and around sort of lean methodology, and we're eager to sort of build more into it. So I really kind of want to learn a lot from you guys, which is why I had no problem sort of volunteering your space. If you're not familiar as well, we're based in Sydney, so most of our development and headquarters are down in Sydney, and we have basically sales, marketing, support, a couple of other dev teams here in San Francisco. And that's kind of I don't know if you guys are also aware, but there's the Lean Software and Systems Conference is in May down in Long Beach, and we're hoping to be down there as well. We're going to have a product manager for Greenhopper, and we'll be there as well. Hopefully there'll be a lot of good presentations around Kanban.
What's this?
Where?
It's in Long Beach. Long Beach?
Yeah, down their way. So it's we did one, I think last year was, the first year we did it. It was pretty popular, so they bring it back again.
Where Lean and Kanban kind of go together?
Yeah, I would say so. Lean is definitely, it takes a lot of good stuff from manufacturing. It's where it kind of originated. Now it's been applied to software development. And then even that group is kind of splintering a bit into sort of dev operations and IT operations, and then software development. And they have a little bit different schools of thought on some things. So, there's tons of resources. You go to our website, we have some stuff. It's not really much speeches.
Right. And it is about everyone that's shown up, and so the format's going to be, we have two presenters, actually 3 presenters from 2 different companies, and they'll present their information, share their experience, do a bit of Q&A, and then then ladies from ModCloth will present and do a Q&A, and then what we can do, depending on the group, what the group wants to do, we can either have people, we can put all the chairs in a circle and have people stand up and share their experience. I've got thoughts and ideas that I like to put out there to folks that might generate conversation and just kind of see how things play out. And feel free to say, hey, can you do this? Because that's cool too. This actually morphed. It's really interesting. So Andy put this idea up, what, a year ago? More than a year ago. And I was just interested in seeing what was going on with the SF Agile group because it had been so dormant since, I think, last spring was the last event. And I just went there and I was like, oh, this is a great topic. Because I started reading about Kanban, and I went ahead and just selected a time. And it just kind of triggered this domino effect. And so it's really morphed, and we're all kind of just playing it by ear here. So I'll go ahead and introduce our next guest, Sam McAfee, and he is the co-founder and client engagement director for RadicalFusion. And RadicalFusion has been producing high-quality web applications and websites for clients since 2002. Sam is an expert at object-oriented software systems design, web application architecture, and usability. He is a vocal advocate of Agile development methodologies, open source software and he supports web standards. So please give a round of applause for Sam, and he's going to show
Thanks, everybody. So yeah, it sounded a lot like the intro on our website. Yeah, so I saw this topic on Meetup and we thought that this was something I wanted to share what we've been working on. I had no idea, I didn't know in advance what the backgrounds were. It's a meetup, so people are kind of coming from all over. So I put this together hoping to go into depth on a few aspects of both Kanban and Lean, but hopefully not to too much minutia to do about it. So yeah, so I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. So I moved to the Bay Area in 1997 from the East Coast, and actually came out of not a computer background in social sciences. I kind of fell into the whole computer thing that was going on here in the area at the end of the 90s. And so I was primarily a self-taught developer and got into web development when everybody else was in late 1999. Just got swept up in the whole .com mania. And I realized that I liked developing websites, and that was something that I didn't realize I was good at. And so I learned a lot of different skills relatively quickly. I spent the first couple of years doing that as a freelancer. There was so much going on at that time. It was relatively easy to kind of get into a place and start working on various aspects of people's sites. And I'm sure a lot of you were around doing the software thing at that time and remember the way it was. And then my partner and I founded RadicalFusion, and it was a way of crystallizing around the freelancing that I was doing in 2002. In the beginning, I was the only developer. My partner was operations, and I was the programmer, and it was really just me for a little while. And as we grew and hired people to help us out, I migrated to being the lead developer along with a couple of other people that I had hired. Then I sort of migrated into more project management, so we can get multiple clients and multiple projects. So I was doing less development at the time, and now I'm kind of functioning more in sort of a sales biz dev role, although I've never really taken my hands off the code. Right now I'm kind of migrating back into some coding as we're really exploring more automation and continuous deployment and having a lot of fun with infrastructures and EC2 tools like Puppet and stuff like that. So kind of getting back into the code, which feels really good. Just quickly a little bit about RadicalFusion. We started in San Francisco in 2002, as I said. Incidentally, it's not really a secret, my partner and I are also married. It's a husband and wife team, and it was completely a virtual company out of our house. And we were virtual for the first 8 years. Even as we grew a team of about 10 developers that were all in the Bay Area, we were all working from our own offices. It was quite some time until we finally created a space. Right now we're in Oakland. We opened our office space last year. It's been 1 year that we've actually been sort of a real physical company, which feels really good. I'll get into more of how that happened further on. The kind of work we do is basically web development. So we don't really have any design in-house, primarily application development team. So working with a lot of open source technologies, PHP and Python and Rails. We work with a couple different types of clients. Originally we started kind of focusing on nonprofits and labor unions and other kinds of community organizations, because that's something that is important to my partner and I. These days we're actually doing a lot more with startups, primarily because we were attracted to the technical challenge of building something totally out of thin air. And then we work with a lot of established companies that are doing piecework and modules that need to be added to some system because it pays the bills. So this is our current sort of breakdown. There's myself and my co-founder, we have a team of 5 engineers, one sort of senior engineer gone business analyst, project manager, and then we use a couple of outsourced front-end visual design interactions on it. Someone's getting mad. I think it's me. So in the beginning, when it was funny because it was just me really at first before I started needing some help. And in 2002, it was really only a year after the Agile, the founding of the Agile movement. So that when I was looking around for a methodology to help organize myself and my own projects, it was kind of hard to get away from waterfall. That was pretty much how things were done. I bought a book by Steve McAfee or something, and learned about sort of phase development. It didn't take very long for me to realize that I was having a lot of trouble even just managing team one with Agile, with waterfall development. It was challenging in terms of keeping track of the scope and managing contract obligations. And I had really only been doing development for a little while too, so I was not the most experienced programmer, and it took a while for me to learn best practices that I kind of take for granted now. After a couple of years of RadicalFusion being just a partnership, a couple of things started happening at the same time. So we started needing help. So we hired a few developers to help us on our team. And around the same time, I was exploring trying to get better at software development and looking into best practices, and I came across things like design patterns and test-driven development and unit testing, that kind of thing. And that ultimately led me to people like Martin Fowler and other luminaries of Agile, Ron Jeffries and stuff. So I found out about this Agile stuff, and I realized it was pretty obvious right away reading the descriptions of what Agile was about, that this was something that could help me manage my small, nascent team of developers as we were trying to build multiple small clients on the move. We didn't have any particular style, but we kind of borrowed just different elements from XP and from Scrum, kind of made our own hybrid of Agile. Now, the way that we were organized in those days was, in some ways, not particularly Agile, in that we weren't co-located. Everything I read about XP was really like, dogmatic about being in the same building with the client, sitting next to you for months at a time. And so we obviously weren't doing any pair programming, because that's kind of hard over Skype. We didn't do any daily stand-ups. We didn't have any sort of official retrospectives. Hardly really any code reviewing at that time. And over the years, I guess, between maybe 2004 and 2006 or 7, we gradually, continued to add better best practices. So we started doing things like continuous integration, where we would have our unit tests kicked off automatically by a server. And at least from my perspective, I think we were doing continuous integration fairly early on. I think a lot of people have heard of it now, and it's those who say it's be a sin not to have continuous integration, but it took a while for that to catch on. So we started doing things like that, automating our build process, and even started doing some acceptance tests, fiddling around with Selenium for web UI automation testing, that kind of stuff. Early tool use. So one of the funny things about Agile tools, and I think it's really interesting that Ken was talking about Jira, because I mentioned a couple of tools in here, not Jira, but I've used Jira, and I actually like it. But it's not one of the tools that we use, and I'm just quickly going to compare two tools that we did use. One of the interesting things about our tool use is that, sort of contrary to the Agile idea of people over tools, we actually ended up kind of using the tool to develop our process. We started using a tool called version 1, and that actually using the tool exposed us to practices that we weren't really that familiar with. So the idea of having iterations and release planning was something that was relatively new to us. And we used version 1 for a fairly long time, probably from 2006 to about 2009, I think. One of the things about version 1 is we found it a little bit heavy for our use. I mean, we're a very small team, and we probably use a very small fraction of the features that are available. But it was still good because it did expose us to the idea of having acceptance tests, and we do have a concept of a storyboard in version 1, and that was kind of my first exposure to the idea of a board as a common concept in Scrum and as we get into Kanban. So, and what I'm trying to do here is kind of give you guys an idea of the trajectory of how our practices led us to adopting Kanban. We abandoned version 1 in favor of a much more simpler tool, Pivotal Tracker, which I'm sure some of you have heard of or used. And the thing that we liked about Pivotal was just that we found that we were using the storyboard view in version 1 a lot, and that was really all we really wanted. We wanted a board that had our stories that showed the workflow from definition of requirements to what's being worked on now, to what's in testing, to what's being deployed. So Pivotal has that kind of view. The UI is very much a nice flow. So that was one reason why we found it attractive. Someone introduced it to me and introduced it to the team. Yeah.
Were you guys distributed, or were you all working in the same office?
At this time, we were actually still distributed when we started using Pivotal. And that was another thing, is that having a web-based tool that we could just create everybody's accounts, that was really nice. Ultimately, we found, interestingly, we started using it when we were distributed, and we're still using it now. And I'll just finish up with what we think we're going to do next. But one of the things that we found hard now that we are co-located is that as we're doing more and more sophisticated tooling in our infrastructure, we're finding it hard to integrate Pivotal into tracking with our version control and tracking with continuous integration builds and getting it kind of tied into the way we track our time for billing and stuff. There is an API. I don't have time to write a whole bunch of plugins for Pivotal, so we're kind of struggling with whether they're, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
What are you using for version control?
For version control, Git and SVN, depending on the project. We're kind of migrating from SVN to Git, but we still have some SVN stuff. I still haven't totally wrapped my head around Git. You can grab everything I can't find on distributed source control. It's still, but I'm not doing a lot of coding right now, so I don't really have to. I'll eventually catch up. So for this, there's sort of like I'm painting sort of Pivotal versus version 1 conflict here in terms of tooling. That we're trying one thing, it's really, really complicated. It'd be great for a huge team of 50 engineers and more of like a product company. Pivotal is very lightweight and easy to get started with, but the more sophisticated our process has gotten, the less it works for us. So now we're kind of trying to figure out what to do. And interestingly, we started using a board, much like this one, physical board in our office. And the more we use the physical board in our office to track our stuff, the less that Pivotal is actually being updated. Like we kind of have to sort of poke each other, hey, is Pivotal up to date? You just move the sticker from one part of the whiteboard to the next. Now you have to go and update Pivotal. It's going to update. So,
Good question. Before you went to V1, you weren't doing that before you started V1? You just automatically jumped into a tool?
well, when we were using V1, we were a distributed team, so we didn't have a common space and we didn't have so there was really no concept of a group space.
So you didn't do it like Skype meetings or
We tried to, but it was really hard to. It was really, version 1 was really the only way that we could use to coordinate what everybody was assigned to. So ultimately, we fell into this thing called Kanban, and basically what happened was, I'm always searching for resources about whatever it is I'm interested in at the time, and there's a sort of chain here that I'm depicting where I was looking for something on Agile. I found this great series of podcasts that were produced by folks at Net Objectives, and started listening religiously to those podcasts. And they talk a lot about lean software development and podcasts. And so I learned about the work of Marion Popovic and the lean software stuff. So now I've got their books, and as I was reading that, I came, they introduce you to the old school Toyota production process, which is where this sort of lean idea originated from. I went out and got the book by Taiichi Ohno about his retrospective on the Toyota production process, and learned about the original Kanban. So for those of you who don't know, Kanban is basically just a word for a signal card, a visual card that's attached to the parts in a Toyota production process. So the way that we're talking about, probably most likely here in this meetup, is going to be more of the software equivalent. So what we're calling Kanban when we talk about it tonight is really borrowing from this concept of a visual cue that shows you where in the process your work is, from concept to completion. So that was like the research that I did. And what I discovered is that Kanban is really part of Lean. And that as I looked into Lean, there were a few kind of core principles in Lean that I started to realize in order for us to really use Kanban, it was important for us to really grok this Lean stuff. So I'm going to just quickly go through these. I'm going to give you a flavor of it, and then we're almost done. I'm going to show you a couple of permutations of the board that we created, and then we can win on that. But basically, in understanding Lean, the things that I took away that were important was this idea of value stream mapping, understanding what cycle time is and how it affects the work that you're doing, what cues are and how they affect cycle time, work in process, the importance of putting constraints around your workflow, the idea of measuring the right things in your process, and finally this concept of stop the line, which is kind of an interesting one that we're having fun with at the office. So the first one, the idea of value stream mapping is something that is fairly simple. You imagine you're producing goods or services for your users or for your customers. Everything that you're doing originates either from a product idea or a customer request. Somewhere there's a concept that needs to be turned into software and delivered at the end of the process to an end user. So to do a value stream map, you essentially identify all the steps in that process. So if it's a sort of DevOps situation, it might be bugs that need to be fixed, or there's a queue of bugs, how do they get prioritized, and then someone assigns it to the next person who's going to work on it, and so on. So you identify all of those steps, and you basically map the value stream from the concept to the delivery. And that essentially gives you a really good model of what your business process, what your workflow looks like. Once you've mapped your value stream, you can take a look at your cycle time. So the cycle time, the way I understand it, is basically the amount of time that it takes one item of work to make its way through that value stream map. And it has to go from stage to stage to stage. And one of the things I've learned from Lean is that the idea behind Lean is to eliminate waste as much as possible. So waste in software takes a lot of different interesting forms that are somewhat different from manufacturing. But one of those is delays in delivery, and another could be thought of as features that are half finished. So as long as you have a couple of things that are almost done but they can't be delivered, that's basically waste until it's actually out the door and consumed by the end user. So looking at your cycle time really helps you think about how quickly things are flowing through your value stream. Related to that is this concept of queues. So in between the steps in your value stream, things are usually either being worked on by one step in your process or they're waiting between steps. The waiting time, usually things sit in some kind of a queue. So one thing that you want to look at when you're examining your value stream is how long are your queues, where are the queues, what gets things into the queues, what gets things out of the queues. Are there ways that you can shorten the size of the queue or work around either work around the steps? And looking at the value stream as a whole process is really important. You can micro-optimize one step in the process and actually create backlogs and bottlenecks later in the process. So another Lean concept is the idea of optimizing the whole. So that's something that you look at when you're thinking about using Kanban. Quick limits is this idea that is really, particularly when you're doing software development, it's not a good idea to work on too many things at once. I think we all multitask at various face times in our lives or in our day. For us, in our team, we found that the more things we have open at once, the more likely it is that each thing is going to take longer because of the task switching required in your brain just to switch from one thing you're working on to another thing you're working on. We have a lot of half-finished work lying around, and it's hard to kind of get it all through the stream and get it out the door to the customer. So one of the ideas behind Lean and Kanban is the concept of putting a constraint on how much you're doing at any one time. Any step in the process, you can apply a limit that's a reasonable amount of resources that you can apply to getting that unit of work done. And magically, things happen to go through queues faster when you're putting that constraint on. For us, we actually have a rule that we are only allowed to have open half the number of the things in our team. And what ends up happening is that we pretty much pair on everything, and unless there's something that's really obviously, it's not going to be useful for someone to pair, but we have a team of 5 engineers, and we really only work on 2 or 3 things at a time. So what ends up happening is that using these lean principles actually encourages us to do things like test-driven development and pair programming. They sort of work off of each other, which is nice. The idea behind measuring progress is basically, as you're looking at your value stream and as you're thinking about how to improve your process, the only way to really do that is to actually measure how things are flowing through the stream. So thinking about looking at your cycle time, looking at things like how long things are waiting in a queue versus how long it's taking to actually work on them, and then adding those two together for the whole cycle time, measuring the impact of these different aspects of the value stream on the value that you're actually producing, if that's possible in what you're doing. And then finally, this idea of stop the line is something that we're really enthusiastic about at my team, which is basically the idea that in a manufacturing plant, if there's a defect discovered, everyone on the line is empowered to pull the cord or blow the whistle and stop the whole production process until you focus in on what's causing that defect and eliminate it from the process. And then you can start the whole process over again, because those defects are waste. So in software, basically what we're doing is, there are various reasons why we might stop everything, and a broken build might be one. Even things in our process, we're very vocal in our team, and everyone's very opinionated, and we will have kind of ad hoc retrospective. Like someone will say, hey, I don't really get why the board is working this way, and I think it's causing some problems. And we might actually stop and have an impromptu discussion on our team about how to actually improve the way that we're working. And that's something that we really encourage. And that's another example of stop. So,
question, Sam?
Yeah.
So, with regards to stop the line,
Sure.
Do you take that so literally as say if a pair checks in a change, and your continuous integration goes red, presumably, obviously that pair stops working and fixes the red as soon as they're aware of it. Does anybody else stop working?
Not necessarily. So there's sort of like an escalation. And it might be something, usually when the build is broken, it is obviously the last person to check in. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's some sort of integration between different branches that were merged. And so if it's something that pair can't solve,
right,
they might ask for help. It's like, okay, hey guys, we don't know what happened here, but we all need to pitch in and figure it out. So that's when we kind of swarm.
Yeah, I didn't see a reason to be more drastic in the situation that I brought up.
One of the others.
But,
the people that just did it, then everybody comes together.
One important aspect of this is it happens automatically because you have good limits. When something breaks, you reach that limit and you can't go forward. You say, well, we can only work on 2 things at a time, and this thing is broken, so we're stuck. And that triggers everyone automatically to say, well, we can't do anything until this is fixed.
Right, exactly.
So as long as you have, and that's sort of an important feature of Kanban, is it doesn't matter what number you pick to start with, to say what your limit should be, because it corrects itself automatically. You either have people who are idle, they're not doing anything because your work limit turns out to be too low, or you've got bottlenecks where you have a work limit of 8 and you get stuck on something, but it's okay because you still have to work on 6 other things. And at some point you have 8 things that are stuck, and you say, oh my God, we should have started working on this when we had 3 things stuck.
Right.
And so you lower your limit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's part of using feedback from
testing and programming.
Oh, interesting.
Meaning that you get the end product, you get the build test cases from the QA team,
Right.
fed into the development team and vice versa.
Right.
So the tests are starting to build the end product rather than the initial unit tests.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way of working. One of the things that we've tried to do is actually put our testing process at the front of the line as a way of specifying what the product is going to be. So we also use a lot of...
That really drives back to your cycle time.
Yeah.
You analyze cycle time every.
Right.
Okay, we go through the unit test, well, what's the right product? What's the right product? We go back to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our case, this is a micro example because we're such a small team. We don't have a big QA department. There's not a lot of infrastructure. But I think all the same principles apply in large organizations. And during the time I've been at RadicalFusion, I've had the pleasure of going out and consulting occasionally at other organizations just on my own. And I've got to see how people are experiencing the challenges of Agile.
I didn't hear, David, what was that?
What's that?
What were you doing?
Dude, you gotta listen, man.
Pair testing.
Okay, so standard TDD is based on unit testing, right, which is solely development based. What you want to do is incorporate the testing. If you're with a big organization, you're going to have a QA environment, right? You're going to have a QA team that write high-level test cases. If you're building stories, you start from a high-level test case, and you feed it back into development. You start at that point, because that will reduce the cycle time to the product that you're delivering. Once you do that, then you get into the sprints or whatever you're utilizing, your time management piece. Then you build unit tests around that, because again, the new customer becomes curated rather than product management or rather than development.
Right, absolutely.
Thank you.
And kind of related to that, one of the things that we're starting to do is actually require from our customers, from our clients, to have them write actually acceptance tests with us in the beginning. So yeah, it's like there's TDD, that's the developer, the unit test level, but there's also acceptance tests, which are a great metric for when you're really done and the acceptance test passed. And you can
One thing I like saying, and just for myself, is that every company I work with, it's the QA department, which is usually accepting every partner.
right.
We need to build up that particular group to actually be a primary partner, because they'll help us with believe it or not, they'll do a lot more help for us, and they become a customer to product management, to development, and ultimately be a product.
Right.
And I'm trying to teach companies that they become the primary customer when we do it.
Yeah, and they should be involved in devising testing strategies right when products are being designed for future level. So really the only thing I have left is to actually show you a couple examples of the board. So we've changed it a couple of times. And these pictures might be a little... before I jump to the board, let me just give you a quick rundown. So to kind of summarize, we had some barriers using Kanban, which were basically the team was virtual. The other thing we were doing is that our projects were all kind of separated. So we'd have a couple developers working on a project through the whole thing, and we had one pivotal project that they were working on, one version 1 project. And they weren't really working together across our whole team. We also were following kind of arbitrarily picking iteration length. And it wasn't always very useful to kind of, sometimes iteration would pass with nothing getting done in the iteration because some of the stories were just too big to do in the iteration. Well, is that the problem with your story, or is it the problem with how you're setting the iteration length? Kind of relative, so it's not necessarily one or the other. And we also didn't know a lot about what metrics to measure. So the solution, one big solution was becoming co-located, which is something that we're really happy that we did, and we never looked back. And we pretty much don't really tell a team, except in rare instances, because the pairing is such an important part of what we're working on. We moved everything to the board, and we kind of don't use separate projects as much, and we actually use the board to kind of see how all of the units of work through all of our different client projects are working through the organization. We started doing continuous deployment, which basically means that we're releasing stuff when it's ready, and it passes all its tests, and it's accepted by the client. They can either take it or release it to their users or whatever, but we're not really following chunks of work and iterations because it didn't really map to what we're actually doing. Things get done at different times, and you should just go as soon as it's ready. And we started tracking some different metrics. We're not really tracking velocity and stuff like that as much now as we're tracking cycle time and wait tracking all of those things in just in a spreadsheet, really. And now we've got a few months of data of our cycle time and all the different metrics. And it's actually becoming a really interesting predictor of how quickly a new item of work can actually get through the office. And it's starting to be really useful when clients ask us, well, how quickly can you get this to us? Now we're going back and looking at our data and just letting the data essentially say that on average, it takes us 20 days to do a feature of such and such complexity. Yeah?
Do you do sizing of work items?
We do. We do still estimate size. We still use story points. And we still use points in velocity. We're kind of, that's one of the things that we're still trying to figure out. Is we're struggling to kind of merge estimating with Kanban, which is, there's a little bit of a, here, I'll show you the next slide. Oh wait, before I get to that. So basically, yeah, we still have a few things that we're trying to figure out. And one of those things is that because we're a consulting agency, we still have to estimate our work. We still have fixed scopes of things we have to do, and we need that.
How did you engineers feel about tracking time? Did it know that you actually needed integration for business purposes? Because typically engineers don't like to get that measured, and it takes 5 hours to do a specific feature, and then maybe 3 hours testing.
Right. Well, we use Harvest to do it as a time tracking tool. Familiar with it? But basically, the developers kind of as a rule mention what story by title or by number they're working on when they commit in their commits to SVN or when they're tracking their time in Harvest. So in Harvest, you just start the timer, and I'm working on the user can log in feature, and that shows up in time tracking. So we have a pretty good idea of how much actual time is being spent on a project by feature. Whether it's billable or not, it's sort of a totally different question. But we can see what people are doing. Plus, we can also see everybody in the room.
You might want to mention also that that level of time tracking is not required by Kanban.
That's right.
Kanban only requires cycle time, which has no impact on the individual engineers and to track their individual things. Cycle time is from the time the product owner says, I want you guys to work on these things next. Those things that as soon as they move to the next column, from that time until they are completed is the cycle time. And it's an average, you end up with an average time that it takes one item to make it through your process. And you can have different size, in Kanban you can have different size items. One item can take 2 months to develop, and something else can take 4 days, because it's an average.
That's software.
Yes.
Because my background is supply chain,
It's
manufacturing is science, right? And Kanban, the Kanban itself also defines what is your lot size, how many pieces do you need, so the car travels back and they start
That's the manufacturing.
So it's an art form to determine the lot size and the cycle time that it actually takes, and that's where I've been struggling with how can I take the Kanban that is my supply chain and actually transfer it to software development.
We actually do try to keep the items of at least relatively similar size, just because it's hard for us to have a visual cue. The visual cues of Kanban are also kind of encouraging. So when something is bigger, it's been sitting in that work in process block for a long time, it has a morale effect as well. So we do try to break things up. It's at least relatively similar sizes so you can see things getting done, checking stuff off the to-do list feels good. It's a little tool.
So as a consulting company, do you get large, long projects that you can then break up into iterations, or
Sometimes.
you get small kinds of chunks of things that you're...
We actually do both. We're moving more towards doing larger projects, and interestingly, the projects that have been the better ones for us as an experience, and also higher quality of work. I'd like to think all of our work is very high quality, but there is definitely a spectrum when you're rushed. The clients that have had a lot of trust in us, and that it's less of a fixed scope arrangement, that there's some agreed upon general business goals for the project, but then they're basically using us as a development team over a period of time that's enough to fit a really good amount of scope in. Those have been better because it's really a collaborative relationship with the client. And yet we still do kind of have iterations in a sense where we do release things to them and they can see things being done. But we do sometimes do smaller projects where it's like specific scope and it's got to be under a budget constraint. And it's tough. I mean, part of what I wanted this presentation to be about is what we're trying to do for like a small, multi-client, multi-project agency where our work is constantly changing, as opposed to being in a team where you have one product that most people are working on all the time. But it can apply to both places, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, so I got a team of 25 that often the tasks coming from clients are a day, or 3 days, or 4 days, and you would have to package them in sprints in order to kind of arbitrarily and
if you're doing
artificially.
Yeah, but in Kanban it's not quite so. There's no required.
So you're literally pulling things.
It's more
off
just a
the
flow.
team.
It's a pull system. Exactly.
Now, I'm glad you said that, because when you say iterations and then you say Kanban, there's a contradiction in terms.
Right.
Because if you look at innovations, I deal with Scrum, and I really like innovations because it's kind of Pavlovian. You really train yourself on what you can do within that period of time.
Right.
Kanban is more open-ended.
Right.
So when you go to a customer, it's very hard to say what you do in a fixed period of time.
Yeah.
Until you start measuring, once you have a cycle time, you actually say,
Yeah, but
if
then-
you give us a new task, it will take us on average 3 weeks.
Absolutely, but how often are those tasks the same?
That's true. You have to.
So that's why I like Scrum. It's time-based. I know Pavlovian concept, but it really does help you fix time frames around certain projects.
Yeah, and certainly they're kind of mix and match. It's not necessarily a contradiction. You can still time box the work that you're doing, in a sense, whether it's officially iterations or not, while using Kanban to measure.
In larger, say, enterprise spaces, I like Kanban for the production end, because there's always issues, there's always impact, so let them take that role. But when doing projects, Scrum, time-based Scrum is, I think personally, much easier to change.
Yeah,
It's better for projects.
Sam, I want to see how your customers are pulling work. Is that gonna be obvious from the boards that you're going to show us, or is that a separate discussion?
It might be.
Okay.
Yeah, let's take a look. So the first version of, it's really hard to see. It's better on the laptop. I'll try and sort of show you. Physically, there's, I was actually thinking about bringing a marker and just showing you. But this is not too bad. You're not missing much. Basically, there are 4 columns, and what we first tried to do is we had the clients here on the side. And then we just had not started, in progress, and to do, and done. And that was, I think this was before we really read enough about how Kanban was really supposed to work. So we started using these sticky notes, and we had them color-coded by the type of task. So feature, bug, or infrastructure, essentially. But at least this was our first attempt at merging everything into one visual board where we could see, we've got all these clients, and some of them have open projects, and so here's where things are at in their project. And it was roughly like, we used rows to kind of figure that out. That didn't really work for very long. And what we ended up realizing is that the idea behind a cube in a team like ours is we wanted everything in a single cube. We wanted to have one cube where all of our work from different projects was merged, and that the team could just chew through that single cube. It ended up being more efficient. So what we ended up doing next was all the tickets are the same color. They could be different projects. They're basically organized by something called a minimal marketable feature, or MMF. It's basically a collection of stories that deal with some sort of feature set. So in this version, we have these different tickets representing these MMFs, and there's still a pivotal project that we're using per client that has the individual stories, and they're grouped by release, and the releases relate to the individual MMFs. And in this case, we have working process limits, and there's actually a number 3 here at the top, and we actually started to close constraint in the working process limits. And then we have done. And down here we had this sort of waiting for client feedback, holding the pen over here where we could put things if they weren't defined.
So what was your done criteria in this case?
What was the...
What qualified as done?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I think that was usually the question that we were asking. I mean, that basically, essentially it was based on the requirements, are we passing all our tests? Really, it's does the client accept it?
So are you in the danger of flipping back into the waterfall method when you're going in a single queue? It's been developed now, it's ready for test. How different are you trying to make this from the waterfall method?
Right, well there really isn't, there aren't a series of stages, so there's no actual waterfall. It's basically being worked on or finished, not so much developed and tested and
But that's possibly because you said you don't have a definite QA department. What if you did and you were handing it off to someone?
Yeah, so maybe I can explain that actually over here. So I think it's part of the process that we use. There's a couple of nested cycles, so let's see if I can do this right. There's an inner cycle that's the TDD cycle. So this is sort of, you pick a story and I'm going to do this all wrong, but I don't have it committed to memory. But basically it's the sort of, write a test. I guess I'll put it over here. Write a test. The test fails. You implement the test. Implement the feature. The test passes. And you kind of go around the circle as you're developing the feature. And then this is part of kind of the similar cycle. That's more, you write an acceptance test. And it's basically the same process. So our stories come in, and it's based on the acceptance criteria that we've defined with the client. We write acceptance tests. And those are always failing at the beginning. And they gradually, they're usually steps. So it's a series of ordered steps. It's essentially the test script that the QA person would use. It's like, how would you test this when you're done? So you figure that out in advance and script it using something like Selenium or Cucumber or one of those automated tools. And those are all failing until we start to implement some of the unit tests in our test-driven development kind of inner cycle. So every time you go around this cycle enough time to get that piece working, another one of these steps will pass. And gradually you go around the outer cycle and you finish the feature, and then that's done. So in terms of what it needs to be done, it's basically how you define it in the beginning for the client. It's iterative. It's not very waterfall in that sense.
Sounds to me like it can turn into mini waterfalls, and it also seems like there's not enough time allocated for exploratory testing.
Sure.
Yes, the feature works, but what else could it have affected?
Right. I don't think there's anything wrong with
Just flip those up. They'll come back. I can see that board now.
Well, maybe we can explore it by looking at the last version. So this is what we're currently doing. The way this is organized is basically, we still follow that process on the board in terms of how we define and work on stories. And then these columns basically say, story needs definition. So we have the stories, we know what their names are, we know roughly what they're supposed to do, but the acceptance criteria haven't been defined yet. The colors are actual individual client projects. So we abandoned the type of story in favor of, we're obviously doing a big project for Orange right now, so that's why the board is mostly orange, but we've got a couple other things in the hopper as well. And then this next column is ready to implement. So everything that's in ready to implement, and recall that there's myself, we have a business analyst, and a project manager. It's our responsibility as a trio to not move anything from this column to that column unless we're confident that the team can grab it and know exactly what to do. So that there's acceptance criteria that they can literally script and get into that TDD flow. If it's not clear enough, it should not have moved across the line. And they'll complain to us and say, I don't know what this means, and we'll stick it back over here. And then we have to go back to the client. Yeah.
So one of the things with Agile is you have all these iterations.
Right.
Where, let's say you have...
You might. In Kanban, you might not. But yeah.
Right. So, like, I work in a place where we do Scrum and we have iterations.
Right.
And the iterative nature is such that if you have a big feature, you might break it down into, let's say, 3 iterations.
Right.
So you go through one, you share it with your product owner.
Sure.
And they might say, hey, I need some tweaks here. That's how it differs from waterfall in the sense that your requirements are not rigid.
Right.
And you can improve along the way.
Absolutely.
So how does that translate to Kanban if you don't have iterations and you just have these stories that you're pulling from the queue? Like,
Yeah, I think I understand your question. These might be adding features to, adding functionality to features we've already done. So this might be, implement the search, and this is like implement a slightly more fancy version of the search. And then this is like, ooh, voila, implement the really cool version of the search. So in that case, the stories could refer to any piece of functionality. It's more just each of these units is something that can be consumed by the user that's actually valuable. It's not just the database schema. It's not, some AJAX call that's not connected to anything real. It's an actual usable feature, but it might not be the only part of that piece of the application. There might be more embellishments that go on later.
So,
yeah.
at what point is your product owner involved? Where he can say, well, what you have is good, but I need some changes to it.
Here, really. So basically you have ready in process. This says deployed and this says validated. And,
Sorry, say that word again. Did you say it validated?
Validated.
Validated.
So it means it's been accepted.
Yeah.
We don't have a rule for how long we sit there, that then it makes us feel good that some stuff has been validated and we can see it. And then we gradually take them off. Basically, when something has been deployed, it's still in the, it might be on the production server or on a staging server somewhere, but the client hasn't necessarily checked off. So the equivalent of pivotal would be that we've clicked deliver, but then there's this accept reject button that someone in our process, whether someone internal or our client, gets to go and click if they're really accepting it. That's kind of the analogy.
Is your compensation tied to any one of these stages? Does it map straightforwardly to this, or?
It depends.
Not really.
We do different types of contracts with different clients. It's not usually, our compensation isn't usually tied to, and thus our budget and ability to pay our team, is not tied to how much functionality we're pushing out. And sometimes what we usually do is we have a big sort of scope that's really broadly defined, that has no implementation specifics. It might just be business goals that we agree to in our contract. The user will be able to search for an appointment, maybe with a little more detail than that. And then we iteratively flesh out the detail with the client in the process. And we negotiate throughout the whole thing what's going to go in and what's going to go out, which is not perfect and challenging, but it seems to work.
So just in the interest of the group,
yeah.
I guess the question is, do we want a break in about 10 minutes? Raise of hands? Yes? No?
Yeah, I'm at the answer. It's really happy.
So if Sam will wrap up, and then we'll have a quick 5-minute break. Yes? Raise your hand, yes? All right.
Restrooms are down the hall here.
So Sam, again in your definition phase, I would ask you to look at your high-level test cases, because they can now drive unit tests and UATs.
Yeah.
And that will reduce your cycle time.
Definitely.
Can you just go back? I have a question about the board. Yeah. Are dependencies expressed by vertical position of the cards?
No, the only spatial expression is the ready to implement are in the order of priority. There aren't necessarily dependencies mapped there. It's a little bit free-form. I mean, the developers and we all kind of are aware of which stories are dependent on other ones. Still kind of figuring that out. That's the best way to do it. So these guys might be working on both of these, and they're not actually working on 2 things at a time, but they know that they can't do this one until they do this one. So they just put them both over there, because as soon as they finish this one, then they'll work on that. So they're not officially working on more than their plan, but they've got sort of their next one they're going to do right behind it, just there, so nobody else picks it up.
I was thinking of task dependencies, not so much program equipment.
Oh, okay.
So if you have a task that can't be started until another task is completed, is that expressed in some way on the Kanban board?
Like testing versus development?
No, like a piece of development that can't be started until another was finished.
I see.
Something is dependent on an API, for example.
Right. We deal with that primarily by mocking and stubbing. So we basically will implement it even without the dependency and stub it out. But then there's still sort of an integration step that might need to happen later that might itself be a whole new story. Make sure these two things work together. There's a story in and of itself. But you can do them in any order as long as you're smart about how you do your architecture, which is, totally different sort of subject from how the stuff goes through, but is also very important.
So, as you get these stories in your projects, how much architecture do you do upfront? What kind of activity?
We try to do iterative architecture. So there's always a certain amount of, so when you have a project that comes in, we typically do a little bit of business process modeling, if you will, and trying to establish what the requirements are. And then that kind of feeds over into aspects of the system and how it's going to, say, how software is going to automate that process. So we might, we'll do object models early on. They typically get changed pretty rapidly. But yeah, we're not afraid to do a little bit of upfront architectural design. We're just not married to any one implementation. We kind of allow it to be changed as we're doing it. But I do think it's important to think ahead about your design patterns and your APIs and what the borders are in your architecture. It is really important. You can't just
Okay, so just again,
wrapping up.
Wrap up.
Yes.
We'll take your question at the end of the presentation.
Okay, so I already mentioned all these things, so we can skip this. These are just kind of the challenges that we're dealing with in applying Kanban to a contract-related agency. And that's it.
Okay.
If you have any other further questions after tonight,
one question
memorize this.
From Todd.
So I was kind of curious how using Kanban you reconcile the fact that your business customers want to know when they'll get something by what time.
Right.
So how you do the projection.
Cycle time. So measuring the cycle time gives us a reasonable way of predicting, because of the averages, when something will get through the whole value stream.
So do you then scope an entire project and?
Sorry?
Do you have different cycle times for different estimates?
No, I mean we're looking at the overall as an average, and we can see that we've mapped the last 100 things that have been through the queue, and that gives us an idea of, on average, they take 20 days from when they're requested before we can get to it, and another 10 days before it actually gets implemented, and then add it together sort of a 30-day cycle time. We're playing around a little bit with the sizing and the estimates and how long it actually took to do each feature, and using that kind of as a coefficient to kind of bend the predictor too. So it's like cycle time, balanced out by how much effort was spent, can give us even a little more accurate based on our estimate of how complex this new thing is. It's just kind of playing statistics.
So we'll get back to a Q&A session.